Don't worry about the group projects, Sophie. Some of us actually understand how real businesses work. You can just handle the formatting. That's what Vanessa Pierce said to me in front of our entire senior seminar 3 weeks before my mother walked into that same room, and every single person in it found out exactly whose daughter I was. Che! My name is Isabel Calloway. For 4 years at Ashcroft University, almost nobody knew that. Everyone knew me as Sophie Hart. And this is the story of the semester that name stopped being enough to protect me, and the day it stopped mattering at all. I want to explain why I did it, because I think it matters more than the reveal itself. My mother is Eleanor Calloway, chief executive of Calloway Group, a company most people have interacted with without ever knowing it, shipping logistics, commercial real estate, a controlling stake in half a dozen consumer brands you'd recognize instantly. My grandmother founded it from almost nothing, 3 generations back, and by the time I was born, the Calloway name opened doors before I'd ever walked toward them myself. I went to an elite private high school where every single one of my classmates knew exactly who I was before I said a word to them. I want to tell you honestly what that does to a teenager. People were kind to me constantly, and I could never fully trust why. I found out at 16 that a boy I thought genuinely liked me had a running bet with his friends about how long it would take him to get invited to our summer house in Nantucket. I found out my best friend since middle school kept a private group chat where she and 2 others discussed, in detail, which of my family's board connections might help their own parents' failing companies. I remembered the exact night I found that group chat, actually, because another girl accidentally sent a screenshot of it to the wrong thread, one that included me. I sat on my bathroom floor for almost an hour reading through months of messages, watching 4 years of what I'd thought was friendship rearrange itself, in real time, into something closer to a long, patient investment. I didn't confront any of them. I just quietly pulled away over the following months, telling myself, privately, that college would be different, that I'd find some way to make it different. So when it came time for college, I made a decision my mother thought was reckless and my grandmother, surprisingly, thought was exactly right. I enrolled at Ashcroft University under my mother's maiden name, Hart, using a modest financial aid package my family arranged quietly through the admissions office rather than my actual family's resources, and I told almost no one who I really was. It took more coordination than people probably imagine, keeping something like that intact for 4 years. My mother had a small, trusted team handle the actual legal and administrative details. A modest trust in the Hart name to cover tuition and living expenses, structured to look like an ordinary need-based arrangement rather than anything connected to Calloway Group. Only the university's president and one dean of admissions ever knew my actual identity, both of whom had worked with my family's foundation before and agreed, at my mother's request, to keep the arrangement strictly confidential. Everyone else, professors, classmates, roommates, knew me only as Sophie Hart, financial aid recipient, unremarkable in every way I could manage to be unremarkable. I drove a 12-year-old hatchback I'd bought myself with summer job earnings, specifically so it wouldn't raise questions. I lived in a standard dorm, then a modest off-campus apartment, split 3 ways with roommates who had no idea. I wanted for 4 years to find out what people actually thought of me when there was nothing to gain by being kind to me. Most of it, honestly, was wonderful in exactly the way I'd hoped. My roommates, Priya and Danielle, became genuinely close friends over 3 years of splitting grocery bills and staying up too late during exam weeks. Friendships built on nothing more complicated than actually enjoying each other's company. Neither of them knew, for the entire time we lived together, that I could have bought our apartment building outright without noticing the expense. I used to sit on their secondhand couch some evenings, watching them argue cheerfully about whose turn it was to do dishes, and think, quietly, that this was worth more to me than anything my real name could have bought instead. I found out. Some of it was wonderful. Some of it, especially that final semester, was not. Vanessa Pierce sat 2 seats away from me in our senior capstone entrepreneurship seminar, a required course where we spent the whole year developing an actual business plan presented at the end to a panel of real judges from the local business community. Vanessa's family had genuine money too, though nothing close to what mine actually was, a mid-sized regional real estate business, enough for private school and a country club membership, enough to make her extremely comfortable and extremely aware of exactly where everyone around her stood in relation to that comfort. I want to be fair to Vanessa in one specific way because I think it matters for understanding her, even if it doesn't excuse anything she did. Her family's business had gone through a genuinely difficult stretch when she was in high school, a near bankruptcy her parents had rebuilt from through years of visible, exhausting effort. I think Vanessa absorbed from watching that a specific anxiety about status that never fully left her, a need to constantly reassert to herself as much as anyone else that she belonged comfortably above whoever she happened to be standing next to. I didn't know any of that yet that first semester. I only understood it much later, and it made her cruelty easier to understand without making it any easier to forgive. Vanessa decided within the first few weeks of that final year that I was a scholarship student who'd gotten lucky with admissions, and she built an entire year of small, casual cruelties around that assumption. Comments about my clothes, always shopped secondhand on purpose because I genuinely liked thrifting, worn like they were evidence of something. Comments about my car in the parking lot, a specific memorable moment early in the semester when she asked in front of half our seminar whether I needed one of those need-based scholarships to afford Ascroft's tuition in a tone that made the question itself the insult. I let most of it slide. I promised myself, enrolling under a different name, that I wouldn't use my real identity as a shield the moment things got uncomfortable. That felt to me like cheating at the exact experiment I'd set out to run. There was one instant in particular, a few weeks before the group project comment, that I still think about. Our seminar had a networking dinner with a handful of local business owners, the kind of event Vanessa clearly treated as essential career development. She'd suggested in front of two of those business owners that I probably wasn't used to this kind of setting, gesturing vaguely at the private dining room and the multi-course meal in a tone dressed up as helpful concern but landing as something else entirely. One of the business owners, an older man who ran a small manufacturing company, actually looked uncomfortable on my behalf, though he didn't say anything either. I remember excusing myself to the restroom afterward, mostly just to have somewhere private to breathe for a minute before rejoining the table with a calm expression back in place. Our capstone project that year required teams of 4 to develop a full business plan, presented at the end of the spring semester to a panel that historically included at least one senior executive from a major regional company, invited by our professor as a kind of prestige judge for the program. Professor Richard Langford ran that seminar, and I want to describe him carefully because he wasn't cruel in any dramatic way. He was worse than that in a quieter way. A man who'd built his whole teaching philosophy around identifying which students had the instincts for real business, and who, I noticed early on, seemed to locate those instincts almost exclusively in students whose family names he recognized from the business pages. He never once asked me a substantive question about my own business plan idea during the first half of that semester, even as he spent entire class periods workshopping Vanessa's plan for a boutique property management startup, clearly modeled on her own family's business, in front of the whole room. There was a moment early in the fall, during a class discussion about family businesses, when a student named Marcus, whose parents ran a small independent hardware store, mentioned his family's business as a potential case study. Professor Langford nodded politely and moved on within 30 seconds. When another student, whose father sat on the board of a publicly traded logistics company, mentioned his family's business in almost the same breath a week later, Langford spent nearly 15 minutes drawing connections, asking follow-up questions, clearly delighted to have a real example in the room. I watched that exact pattern repeat itself in smaller ways almost every week that semester. My business plan, which I'd been developing quietly for months, proposed a supply chain auditing platform specifically designed to help mid-sized manufacturers verify ethical labor practices across their supplier networks. A real structural problem I understood in far more depth than any of my classmates realized, because I'd watched my own mother wrestle with exactly this challenge across Callaway Group's global operations for most of my adolescence. When I finally presented my initial concept to the seminar, about 2 months in, Professor Langford's feedback was brief and dismissive. He said the idea was admirable in spirit, but that I clearly didn't understand the actual scale and complexity of global supply chains, and that this kind of platform sounds nice in a classroom, but companies operating at real scale have entirely different priorities than the ones you're imagining. Vanessa, sitting 2 seats away, didn't even try to hide her small, satisfied smile. Here is what almost nobody in that room knew. Callaway Group had, in fact, been quietly piloting a nearly identical supply chain auditing system for the past 18 months, developed internally at my mother's direction after a supplier scandal 3 years earlier had genuinely shaken her personally and professionally. I'd sat in on 2 of the planning meetings myself during a summer visit home, watching consultants present almost the exact framework I later built my entire capstone project around. I didn't say any of that to Professor Langford. I simply thanked him for the feedback and told him I intended to keep developing the idea anyway because I believed in it. He gave me the kind of tolerant, faintly amused look adults give children who insist on believing in something impractical. The group project incident happened about 3 weeks before the final pitch competition when Professor Langford, without explanation, reorganized several students into new teams for a smaller supplementary assignment. I ended up on a team with Vanessa. Bub, don't worry about the group project, Sophie, she said in front of our entire seminar during a class period where Langford had us briefly present our team assignments out loud. Some of us actually understand how real businesses work. You can just handle the formatting. A couple of classmates laughed. Not unkindly exactly, just the reflexive laugh people give when someone confident says something dismissive with enough charm attached to it. I remember feeling the specific, familiar sting of being reduced in one sentence to something purely decorative and useless, in front of a room full of people I'd spent almost 4 years quietly building a life alongside. I told her evenly that I was capable of contributing substantively to the actual strategy, not just the formatting. She waved a hand, already turning back to her laptop. Sure, whatever helps you feel included. I want to be honest and tell you that moment nearly broke my 4-year experiment entirely. I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward, the same 12-year-old hatchback Vanessa had made fun of more than once, and seriously considered calling my mother, telling her I was done pretending and letting the Callaway name walk back into my life the very next morning to make people like Vanessa Pierce regret every single word. I didn't do it. Not yet. I called my grandmother instead, who'd always understood my reasons for doing this better than my own mother had. She listened to the whole story and said something I've held on to since. Isabel, the name will always be there whenever you decide you need it. The real question is whether you can still recognize your own worth without it, on the days people like this girl try to take it away from you. I didn't feel especially strong hearing that, but I decided to keep going anyway. My grandmother had run Callaway Group herself for almost 30 years before handing it to my mother. And she told me once, years earlier, about a nearly identical humiliation from her own early career. A boardroom full of men who'd assumed she was somebody's secretary until the day she corrected them by signing the very contract they'd been waiting on her approval to finalize. She never let that story turn into bitterness, as far as I could tell. She just let it become a kind of quiet patience. The specific patience of someone who already knows how these stories tend to end, given enough time. The final pitch competition took place in the university's largest lecture hall, open to the whole business school, not just our seminar. Professor Langford had spent weeks building anticipation about that year's guest judge, a significant figure in the regional business community he refused to name in advance, clearly enjoying the suspense he was creating. I'd spent the week leading up to it rehearsing my presentation obsessively in our apartment living room, with Priya and Danielle sitting on the couch pretending to be judges, asking me tough questions about market viability and competitive positioning. Neither of them had any idea, of course, exactly how personal my answers actually were, or how directly my hypothetical understanding of large-scale supply chains connected to a woman running board meetings a few hours away. I found out who it was about 90 seconds before everyone else in that room did. I was sitting near the back waiting for my turn to present, running through my notes one final time, when the double doors at the front of the hall opened and my mother walked in. I remember the specific jolt of recognizing her silhouette before I'd even consciously processed what I was seeing. The exact particular way she carries herself in a room, a posture I'd know anywhere, developed over 3 decades of walking into boardrooms full of people who all wanted something from her. I want you to understand, my mother almost never made public appearances like that without weeks of advanced security planning. without her assistant coordinating every detail. I had no idea, sitting in that lecture hall, that Professor Langford had reached out to Callaway Group's community outreach office months earlier requesting a guest judge, and that my mother, recognizing the university's name and, I'd later learn, recognizing my own capstone project description in a program brochure her office had reviewed as a courtesy, had decided to attend personally instead of sending a delegate. She didn't know, walking in, that Sophie Hart and her own daughter were the same person sitting in that room. Or rather, she absolutely knew. She'd known the entire time, obviously, since I was her daughter. What she didn't know was that I hadn't told anyone else in that room, and that my carefully maintained secret was about to collide, in real time, with her presence at the front of it. Professor Langford, visibly starstruck, spent almost 2 full minutes introducing her to the room, listing Callaway Group's holdings, her position, her reputation, practically vibrating with the specific excitement of a man who just landed a far more impressive guest than he dared hope for. The presentations began. Vanessa's team went forth, her boutique property management plan polished and confident, clearly rehearsed for exactly this kind of audience. My mother asked 2 sharp, specific questions about scalability that Vanessa fumbled slightly, recovering with practiced charm rather than substance. I went sixth. I remember standing up, walking to the front of that lecture hall, my mother sitting directly in the center of the judges' table, giving me nothing more than the same polite, attentive expression she gave every other presenter. I understood, in that walk to the podium, that she was giving me the choice. She would let me present as Sophie Hart, straight through to the end, if that's what I wanted. My hands were shaking slightly as I set my notes down on the podium, and for a moment I genuinely considered just delivering the presentation exactly as rehearsed, letting the moment pass, keeping the secret intact for another few weeks until graduation made the whole question irrelevant. I thought about Vanessa's comment from 3 weeks earlier, about formatting, about the specific tone she'd used. I thought about my grandmother's voice on the phone, asking whether I could still recognize my own worth without the name. I thought about 4 years of careful, deliberate hiding and asked myself, honestly, what exactly I was still protecting by continuing it in this particular room, in this particular moment. I decided I didn't want that anymore. I began my presentation the way I'd planned, walking through the supply chain auditing platform, the market gap, the technical framework. About 2 minutes in, I paused, looked directly at my mother, and said, "Before I continue, I want to be honest with this room about something I should have said months ago." The room went quiet in that specific way. Rooms do right before something unexpected happens. "My name isn't actually Sophie Hart," I said. "It's Isabel Callaway. Eleanor Callaway is my mother. I enrolled here under a different name 4 years ago because I wanted to know what people actually thought of me and of my work without my family's name doing the deciding for them. I want to describe the sound in that lecture hall because I've never quite heard anything like it before or since, not gasping exactly. More like 200 people collectively recalculating something at the exact same moment. The specific silence of an entire room's assumptions quietly rearranging themselves in real time. I looked over at Vanessa. Her face had gone genuinely pale, the practiced charm completely gone, replaced by something closer to raw, unfiltered panic. She'd spent the whole semester positioning herself, carefully, as exactly the kind of student Professor Langford's guest judges would find impressive, cultivating an image for precisely this kind of moment. I watched her realize in real time that she'd spent an entire year condescending to someone whose family could, with a single phone call, reshape her own family's business prospects for a generation, and that realization seemed to physically shrink her in her seat. My mother, to her enormous credit, didn't say a single word during any of this. She simply watched me, her expression unreadable to everyone else in that room, but perfectly clear to me. Quiet, fierce pride. The specific look she'd given me exactly twice before in my life, both times when I'd done something difficult entirely on my own. I continued my presentation. I told the room that the supply chain auditing platform I designed wasn't a classroom exercise divorced from real business scale the way Professor Langford had suggested months earlier. I told them Callaway Group had been quietly piloting a nearly identical framework for 18 months after a supplier scandal that had genuinely damaged trust with several of our largest retail partners, and that I'd built my entire capstone project drawing directly on that real high-stakes experience without ever mentioning it, because I wanted my ideas judged on their own logic rather than my family's balance sheet. Huh. I looked directly at Professor Langford when I said the next part. I was told by someone in this room that this idea sounds nice in a classroom, but doesn't reflect how companies operating at real scale actually think. I'd like my mother to speak to that directly if she's willing, since she runs one of those companies. She Mueller stood up. I want to tell you, she didn't do it to embarrass anyone unnecessarily. That's never really been her style, whatever people assume about someone in her position. But she also wasn't going to let that moment pass without saying something true. Callaway Group greenlit a pilot program 18 months ago, she said, addressing the whole room. Built on almost exactly the framework my daughter just presented, developed independently, without my direct involvement, using instincts about supply chain accountability that our own internal consulting team took considerably longer to arrive at. She paused, looking directly at Professor Langford. I'd be very curious to know what specifically about this plan struck you as unrealistic, Professor, because from where I sit, it's already operating quietly inside a company with over 40,000 employees. Professor Langford's face had gone the particular color of a man realizing, in front of 200 witnesses, exactly how badly he'd misjudged something. Tabak, he tried, to his credit, to recover with some grace. He said something about how impressive it was to learn the idea had real-world validation, carefully avoiding acknowledging the specific dismissiveness of his original comment. My mother didn't push further. She'd made her point, plainly, and she seemed to understand that grinding it further into the room wouldn't actually change anything meaningful about how Professor Langford ran his seminar going forward. I finished my presentation. The judges' scores, when they came in an hour later, placed my project first in the entire competition, a decision I later learned had actually been largely settled before my mother ever said a single additional word, based purely on the two outside judges' independent scoring sheets. One of those outside judges, a venture investor who specialized in sustainability-focused startups, actually sought me out afterward to ask whether I'd consider pursuing the concept commercially after graduation, entirely unaware, it seemed, of exactly how thoroughly the concept was already operating inside a company with global reach. I told him I'd think about it seriously, and I meant it. There was something genuinely satisfying about an offer like that landing on its own merits, from someone judging the idea purely on the page in front of him, no name attached yet to complicate his assessment. Vanessa found me afterward, in the hallway outside the lecture hall, her whole posture different than I'd seen it in 4 years of knowing her. I didn't know, she said. It wasn't quite an apology. Not yet. Just 3 words. The same 3 words I've heard described from an entirely different terrace, in an entirely different story about a family, when the truth finally lands somewhere it can't be argued away from anymore. I told her that not knowing wasn't really the issue. I told her that everything she'd said to me over the past year, every comment about my thrifted clothes and my old car and my need-based scholarship, she'd said believing I had no power to affect her life in any way, which meant she'd said it because she genuinely believed it, not because she didn't know who my mother was. If you'd known I was a Callaway from day one, I said, would you have ever spoken to me that way? She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. No, I wouldn't have. That's the actual apology you owe me, I told her. Not for the specific things you said, for the fact that you'd only have been kind to me if you'd known there was something in it for you. I didn't say it cruelly. I want to be clear about that. I said it because I thought of everything that happened that afternoon. It was the one sentence that might actually matter to her. Going forward, in some room years from now where she doesn't yet know who she's talking to either. She didn't have a response for that. I don't think there really was one available to her in that moment. The rest of that week on campus was strange in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. A few classmates who'd never spoken to me suddenly wanted to, clearly recalibrating some internal social ranking they'd quietly maintained all year. A couple of professors from other departments, ones I'd taken electives with and barely interacted with since, sent oddly formal emails congratulating me on my well-deserved recognition, language that felt noticeably different from anything they'd said about my actual coursework the semester before. I found the whole thing faintly exhausting. Honestly, watching people's warmth toward me visibly recalibrate in real time, exactly the dynamic I'd spent 4 years hiding from in the first place, just now happening all at once instead of slowly over years. Priya and Danielle found out the same way everyone else on campus did, watching a video of my presentation that a classmate had recorded and shared, which spread through the school within about 6 hours. They called me together that night, both of them on speakerphone, and I braced myself, genuinely uncertain how 3 years of friendship built on a false name might hold up against a truth that large. They weren't angry, which surprised me more than I expected. Priya just asked, quietly, whether I'd trusted them at all over 3 years of splitting rent and groceries and long nights before exams. I told her honestly that it had never been about trust in them specifically, that I simply hadn't known when we first met whether the friendship in front of me was going to be real, and by the time I was certain it was, the lie had gotten too large and too long-standing to easily walk back without it changing everything between us anyway. Danielle said after a long pause that she understood the reasoning, even if it stung a little to hear it. We stayed on the phone for almost 2 hours that night. By the end of it, I believed we were going to be fine. We were. Professor Langford asked to speak with me privately a few days later in his office. He apologized, more formally this time, for dismissing my original proposal without giving it genuine consideration. He admitted somewhat painfully that he'd spent most of that semester paying closer attention to students whose family names he recognized, and that my project was the clearest evidence yet of exactly how much that habit had cost him professionally in terms of actually teaching well. I told him I appreciated the admission and that I hoped it changed something structural about how he ran the program rather than just how he treated me specifically now that he knew who I was. He said the department was already discussing a blind submission process for initial project proposals the following year so that ideas got evaluated before anyone in the room knew whose name was attached to them. I don't know if that change will hold long after I've graduated and moved on. I hope it does. I think it matters more than anything that happened to me personally that semester. My mother and I talked at length on the drive home that evening. She admitted she'd wondered, more than once over the past 4 years, whether letting me carry out this experiment for so long had been the right call as a parent. I told her I didn't regret a single semester of it, even the hard ones, maybe especially the hard ones, because I'd learned things about people, about myself, about which kindnesses were real and which ones were transactions, that I never could have learned any other way. She asked whether I planned to keep using the Hart name at all in whatever came after graduation. I told her I hadn't fully decided yet, though I suspected the choice had mostly already been made for me the moment that recorded video of my presentation started circulating around campus. She laughed quietly at that, agreeing it was probably true, and admitted she'd actually been more nervous walking into that lecture hall than she'd let on to anyone, uncertain until the very last moment whether I wanted her to say anything at all, or simply sit quietly and let the panel scores speak for themselves. Your grandmother said something to me once, my mother told me, when I was about your age and going through something similar, though nowhere near as deliberately engineered as what you just pulled off. She said the money and the name will always open doors. The only real question is whether you like who walks through them when you're not sure the door's actually open yet. I graduated a few months later. Vanessa and I never became friends. Not really, though our final interactions were civil in a way that surprised me. I heard secondhand that she'd become noticeably more careful in her final semester about how she spoke to people whose circumstances she didn't fully understand yet. I don't know if that change was permanent. I hope for her own sake more than mine that it was. We crossed paths once more, actually, at graduation itself. Both of us in caps and gowns waiting in the same alphabetical line for an entirely unrelated reason. She congratulated me, quietly, genuinely, and told me she'd been thinking all semester since the pitch competition about how differently she might have treated 100 smaller interactions across her whole life if she'd simply assumed from the start that everyone she met might matter more than she could immediately see. I told her that was a good thing to carry forward, whatever she ended up doing with it. I meant that too. I think about that whole 4-year experiment often and about what it actually taught me. Not that wealth doesn't matter, because obviously it does, enormously in ways I've never pretended otherwise. What it taught me was something quieter than that. It taught me exactly how many people are kind to you conditionally, waiting to find out what that kindness might eventually cost or earn them, and exactly how few people are kind to you simply because kindness is who they are, regardless of what you can or can't do for them in return. I think about a specific moment from sophomore year, actually, one I haven't mentioned yet, that I've held on to more tightly than almost anything from that whole 4-year experiment. My hatchback broke down on the side of a highway during a rainstorm, and a classmate I barely knew, a quiet engineering student named Oliver, pulled over without hesitation, helped me change a tire in the pouring rain, and refused any payment for it afterward, laughing off the offer like it was a strange thing to even suggest. He had no idea, that whole soaked, miserable hour on the shoulder of that highway, that the woman he was helping could have bought him a car of his own without noticing the expense. He just saw someone who needed help and helped. I think about him more than I think about Vanessa, if I'm honest, because his version of the story is the one I actually want to believe most people are capable of. If you've ever wondered, in some quiet and comfortable way, whether people in your life like you or like what you can offer them, I understand that particular loneliness better than most people ever will. I don't have a clean formula for telling the difference beforehand. I only found mine out by accident by hiding almost everything for 4 years and watching carefully who stayed decent anyway. Most people, I want to say clearly, were exactly as kind to Sophie Hart as they would have been to Isabel Calloway. That matters to me more than the story of the ones who weren't. But the ones who weren't taught me something too about how quickly respect can evaporate the moment someone decides you have nothing they want, and how quickly it can reappear the moment they realize they were wrong. I don't know exactly what I'll do with the rest of my life yet, whether I'll eventually take a formal role at Callaway Group the way my mother expects, or build something entirely my own the way some quieter part of me still wants to. I know whatever I choose, I'll be doing it with a clearer picture than most people in my position ever get, of exactly who shows up for you when there's genuinely nothing in it for them. That's a strange kind of gift, buried inside 4 years of an occasionally lonely experiment. I wouldn't trade it back now, even on the days it cost me something real. Thank you for listening to my story tonight. If it reminded you of a moment you found out who was actually kind to you for the right reasons, I'd love to hear about it. That knowledge, once you have it, is worth holding on to carefully. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around, there's always another one waiting. Take care of each other out there. Good night, everyone.